Hello, my fundraising chums. I'm back with another episode of Two Peas on a Pod with Giles Pegram, and today we are chatting with one of my absolute favourite fundraisers. I've worked with her a number of times over the years, and it's always been a delight. You know, as when you run an agency, it's not often that you actually learn from your clients, but with our guest today, that's absolutely the case. Her name is Harpreet Kondel. You'll probably have heard of her, and she has recently been elected chair of the CIOF. And in today's discussion, Harps is sharing her thoughts on fundraising, what she thinks the CIOF needs to offer fundraisers, and what the future of fundraising could actually look like. And I hope you enjoy it, and happy fundraising.
Harps, I just say one thing. We're not going to put you on the spot. You've been elected for a short while now. You've got time with your trustees to have a way day about the future. We're not going to say, you know, the way Keir Starmer's been treated at the moment is, you know, he's been in post for a few weeks. Why are there small boats still crossing the channel? And you think, give the guy a chance. You know, they've been there for a few weeks. So you know. You can say what your thoughts are, but we won't say, you don't say what the future of the Institute is going to be, except as you want to. But why don't you, just for our viewers who don't know you, just say a bit about yourself and your background.
Okay. Gosh, so where do I start? I mean, I think I've been a fundraiser for over 30 years, so that's quite a while. I think I've got a lot of sort of hands-on experience of having worked in lots of different organisations. And I've initially started out as a fundraiser actually at Pelham Bales, when in the daytime I used to work in a print mailing house, managing various clients like Penhaligon's, Range Rover and others, and doing fulfilment on their behalf. And then in the evening, 3 or 4 times a week, I used to go and be a caller. So I'd start work from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And then I sometimes used to do a double shift on the weekend to pay my student loan back. So I basically did all of that, and then a vacancy came up in the account team, which I applied for, and I got the job. And then I worked across lots of different clients, like the Red Cross was one of our clients, Terence Higgins Trust, Greenpeace, National Trust, and various others. And then my boss left and went to work at the Red Cross and asked me to come and join him, and that is where I first went into charity. And then I did a 10-year stint at the Red Cross, and basically set up their legacy marketing programme from scratch, set up their supporter care function because we didn't have one, and also their supporter development programme really, which was quite a new programme when I joined in its infancy. And then I left there and worked at Bernard Works for a little while, a direct marketing agency. And then I went on to Bernardo's, where I served for 7.5 years, doing all of the same stuff I did at the Red Cross, looking after sort of data, supporter care, acquisition, retention and legacy, and also some of the Bernardo's Big Toddle events as well. And then I did a Salesforce CRM implementation for 2.5 years, and then I left. And then since 2016, I've been working for myself, going in and out of lots of charities, doing interim roles, and worked in quite a lot of different organisations during that time, and absolutely love it.
That sounds like it's a really varied career. So you're an all-round fundraiser. There's not much you don't know about. So that's great. Mark?
Key question for me really is, you know, and I'm so pleased that you are going to be the new chair of the CIOF. It's great having someone there with your experience and your background. A key question that I'd like to kick off with, and I suppose it's one that we weave into every single conversation. Where do you think the fundraising sector is at the moment? What are your thoughts about what's good, what's bad, where we could improve? Because obviously in your lofty position, at some point you might be able to influence this.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, well, where do you start with where the sector is right now? I mean, I think we all know, having gone through COVID, that the sector is currently still facing sort of reverberations of that, and I think a lot of charities are struggling. Quite a few of the big ones, from what I understand, are struggling. There seems to be redundancies happening and cost-cutting exercises throughout lots of organisations, and as we know, when costs start to get cut, fundraising tends to be one of the areas that people look to, because they're not seeing that sort of immediate return, especially with acquisition. So I think we are facing quite a challenging time. That said, I think there are some charities that are still doing very well. We know, for example, last Christmas, lots of sort of UK charities really struggled, but actually those working in overseas aid or working in Palestine in particular did quite well. So it really, I think, depends on your cause as well, and how successful you are at kind of getting your message over. So I think the landscape is a challenging landscape. But that said, I think, with the advent of new technology and advances that are being made, I think, that has kind of levelled the playing field a little bit. A smaller charity can be on Facebook doing Facebook fundraising and generating revenue from that, the same way a big one could be. So I think technology has levelled the playing field a little bit, but I think there's actually much more we could do in terms of supporting the sector to do better fundraising. I think one of the things I've certainly understood, having gone in and out of lots of organisations, is that most often we don't even have the basics in place. So we're trying to run before we can walk. It's like chasing the AI as if it's going to be the advent of a new dawn. But actually, let's get some of the basics right first. How are we acquiring new supporters? How are we retaining them? How are we making sure all supporters are getting a legacy message? I think those things are not being done consistently enough throughout most organisations. So I think whilst we're in a struggling landscape, I think there's real pockets of success, is what I would say at the moment.
There's a lot there to cover, but try to pick up on one point, which you said that in the context of COVID or after COVID, people are still struggling and fundraising is getting cut. And I'm reminded of, was Ogilvy, the advertising guru, said, when times are good, you should advertise.
Yeah.
And when times are bad, you must advertise.
Yeah.
And I think, I come from a background, and luckily the charities I work with believe it. If you cut your fundraising, you're not going to have the money for the services.
Yeah.
If you cut your services and keep your fundraising, you're going to build up the money for services. And do you feel that's actually not what's happening? Do you feel there's a mood in the sector that's actually cutting fundraising expenditure because people think fundraising is more difficult?
Well, I think there's a lack of understanding in most organisations at senior management level about fundraising and how it works. People expect to see immediate returns, and I'm afraid it isn't all about immediate returns. I definitely think that most people could probably make their existing supporter file work harder for them. It's a bit like people are always chasing to get new donors through the door, yet your existing ones are falling out at the bottom of the funnel. What are you doing to retain that and support that? So I would say, actually, the challenge is, like you say, Giles, whilst we're in a struggling economic climate, which we absolutely are, the demand for services is going through the roof. So it's very challenging for charities to just cut services on the assumption that then they're going to make that money back through fundraising. So obviously it's easier to cut fundraising. I quite agree it's not the right thing to do, and in the longer term the damage will be seen 2 or 3 years down the line. But I think that's an education piece, which I think there needs to be a much greater understanding at senior management level, at board level, and particularly a lot of chairs of boards who are coming from a commercial sector. If they're running Marks and Spencers and they're chairing a board in a charity, they expect fundraising to work in the same way, and it doesn't operate in the same way. The returns aren't as immediate. When you're selling a top in Marks and Spencers, they're buying it and immediately you get that profit. It's not the same when you're a charity, and as we know, payback can really vary depending on what acquisition tool you're using.
It always seems to be fairly obvious that if it's becoming more expensive to acquire new donors, which it is, the answer to that is to make the file work harder.
Yeah.
Is to keep your supporters longer.
Yeah.
Because if you keep your supporters longer, then you're going to maximise the lifetime value, even if the cost of acquisition is higher. And so I suppose the obvious question is, what do you think the Institute might be able to do, in your view, and without prejudice to your away day, but what do you think that the Institute might be able to do to change the culture of approach to investment in fundraising?
Well, I think for me, that's a two-pronged approach. One is to try and educate senior management and boards and working with organisations like Association of Chairs, and collaborating with other sector bodies to really educate our senior management and our chairs on how to be better fundraising supporters, because I think at the moment that is a challenge. They don't really understand how it works. It's a funny thing that's going on over there. They don't really understand it, And the tragedy is when we say fundraising, people just assume it's one way of giving. As we know, there's many different avenues of giving within fundraising. You know, a major donor fundraising program is not the same as an individual giving program, as not the same as a community fundraising program. They all have different returns on investment, and I think there needs to be a much wider understanding of how each of those operate, and actually how, as a board, can we support those each of those areas. You know, they can't really do much in the way of supporting individual giving, but they could certainly do much more in the realm of supporting perhaps major donors. And then I think the second thing is how at the Institute can we provide tools and best practice to charities to enable them to support themselves better. So obviously, as an independent fundraiser, I've now got a little toolkit that I use when I go into organisations to help them improve and put in practice the basics, even trying to understand what does a 12-month supporter journey look like. Most charities haven't even got that written down, and that's quite basic for me, sort of day one fundraising, trying to understand, are we doing a welcome? Are we thanking people? How many asks are we putting to them over the course of a year? And how are we making sure that we're keeping them engaged? You know, if they're coming from different organisations, fundraising programmes, you know, if you've got a community fundraising programme, what happens to those people once they've run the marathon? With lots of organisations, that's it. Nothing else happens to that person. Whereas I'm saying, actually, they've done that for you. What can we get them to do for you next? What's the next step on that journey?
So let's come on to the Institute now. So what made you apply to be chair of the Institute?
So Giles, I didn't actually apply to be chair of the Institute. I was actually asked to put myself forward to be the chair of the Institute. And the first person actually that suggested it to me was the wonderful and late Mark Astorita, who on a number of occasions said to me, Harps, I think you'd make a really great chair of the Institute. I, of course, had complete imposter syndrome and thought, how on earth, why would they want me to be the chair of the Institute? What do I know about anything? And then, of course, when Nadine's term was coming to an end, she approached me and asked me if I would be interested in being the next chair, as I was already sitting on the board of the Institute and also chairing that fundraising talent working group. So I think now that I've taken the role on, I actually think it's quite an important role. And I still do have that imposter syndrome about what am I going to achieve in this role. But actually, as the first woman of colour to hold that role, I think it's quite an important point, actually, in fundraising sector. I want other people of colour to be able to see me and say, I could be in that chair one day, just like Harps is. So that's the first thing for me. But second of all, I think the number of years of actual fundraising experience I've got under my belt, I think really qualifies me to be the chair of the Institute. And I hope that I can sort of bring those to bear and help the Institute to be a real supporter and advocate for our sector by making sure things like the basics are in place and we're actually, really thinking about what's coming down the road, but not just chasing shiny new things, making sure we've got the basics in place. So, if there's things like that we can put on our website where people can sort of download toolkits to enable them, particularly smaller charities, because since I've been an interimer, I've worked in small, medium and large charities, and being a one-man band fundraising is a very challenging thing to do, especially when you have no HR department to support you, you've got no data team to support you, you don't have a supporter care function. You are literally trying to do all of those roles as well as trying to bring the money in. So what can we do to support them and enable them to do better, I think, is probably some of the things I'll focus on.
I'll come back to that. Well, I'm really delighted that you are the chair. You and I worked together on the Commission on the Donor Experience, and I just know how sharp you are. And you're a person who gets things done, and I really like that. You don't just waffle and talk about it. You're action oriented. Now that you are chaired, what can you list 3 things, if you like, that you'd really like to get done within the Institute?
Okay.
Your top 3.
My top 3. My gosh. So I think the first thing for me is I see it quite often on threads where people are commenting and saying they don't understand the value of their membership of the Institute. So the first thing I want to embed in the Institute and within our wider membership, and of course those charities that are not currently members of the Institute, is what their membership provides. So not only what does it provide them on a one-on-one level, what does it provide their organisation, but also what does the Institute do for the sector. because behind closed doors, the Institute is advocating, liaising with government, lobbying, and doing all sorts of things behind the scenes for our sector. So when gift aid legislation might be up for change, we'll be the ones that are behind the scenes lobbying to make sure that the best outcome is provided for charities. So I think that's the first thing, is really sort of embedding the understanding of what my money pays for. And I'd really like to see us grow the number of people who are currently members of the Institute. That has already started with some of the work that Rob Cope has done in terms of overhauling the membership programme. So I think that would be number one for me. I think some of the other stuff I kind of already have mentioned in terms of sort of leadership education in the sector and providing that understanding about what fundraising is. So how do we do that? So I think that's another area that's quite a big area, and how on earth would we manage that? I think that's the challenge that I would probably throw back to the team who work in the Institute, because I think we really need to get under the skin of that, and that might well mean that we have to work with other sector bodies to provide that education. So obviously, as the chair, I'm now going on the Association of Chairs training, and I'm, Joe Saxton's obviously the chair of the Association of Chairs, but Joe was also a fundraiser. So I'd quite like to work with Joe to think about how do we, educate chairs to be better supporters of fundraising, and see if he might be willing to work with us on that. I think my final thing is all around sort of providing the resources and the tools for us to all be better fundraisers. But obviously that means we need fundraisers coming into the sector, we need fundraisers to stay in the sector. So how do we make sure that we're retaining and recruiting that new talent in? That's another big area that I think we need to focus on. So I think I might have done 4 there, Giles.
They sound very good to me. It's interesting. Your first one is I think a lot of people think about what's in it for me. And I think one of the things you're saying, which is really important, is one of the things in it for you is actually to have a voice for you in the outside world. If there is another Olive Cook, God help there isn't.
Yes.
It's the Institute that's actually going to be in the forefront of dealing with that.
Yeah.
So even if as an individual you don't feel you're getting anything directly out of the Institute, you're getting a lot out of it indirectly in terms of having a voice in the sector. So that.
Yeah, and we probably do need to do a better job of raising the awareness about that. What are the things that we're talking to government about and lobbying on behalf of the sector? Because I feel like we do it, but we do it behind closed doors. So how do we make our membership body aware of what we're doing to support them? Because I think they just don't know.
That's terrific. I feel I've been hogging this conversation. Mark, you come in.
Oh, you never hog, Giles. You never hog. To me, I'd like to jump back, and I'd like to stick on the CIOF. I always want to call it the IOF.
Yeah, me too.
I struggle with the C.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's a good thing to see, though.
Yes.
We mustn't forget that.
Oh.
Yeah, you're passionate
Yes.
about the sea, aren't you?
I am passionate about the sea, because I think actually people have said the Institute spent too long chasing chartered status. But for me, if I'm sitting in the room with the finance director who's a chartered accountant and I'm a fundraiser, I'm not on the same sort of level playing field as that individual. I think it actually gives me power. And I also think actually it makes the profession seem more professional and recognised by others that are not perhaps working in our sector. So I think it's actually a really important tool for us to get that recognition.
Sorry, Mark, I interrupted you. But yes, chartered, good.
Not for the first time, dear viewer.
Nor the last.
Obviously, if we're talking about the sea, it does add status, adds a level of power, and I think obviously the CIOF is a very powerful body for fundraisers. And one of my questions about where you might go really relates to some of those points about the difficulty in the market, because there's some organisations that have done very well. That we've had organisations, a number of our clients have had increases in income year over year over year. Someone like Marie Curie, someone like Alzheimer's Society, someone like Sense, so large right down to small. And the point that you made earlier on about development agencies in terms of UNHCR absolutely flew in 2022, obviously after the invasion of Ukraine. But there are other organisations that struggle. And your point about best practice, I think, is very important, because when I look at the conference, I don't often see a huge amount of best practice presentations. There'll often be presentations on, this is a fun new idea, have a look at this, before the results are even in. And that would drive a whole host of, that's a big shiny ball that's gonna get people looking, oh, we need to do something over there. There's not necessarily much on market research, on data about what's happening in the sector. Because at the moment, one of the things that we're seeing is the mid-value sector to high value. Any organisations that are doing that well are doing well. And if we do a projection 20 years hence, we know that there is going to be the biggest wealth transfer in history from those boomers, the older boomers, to the younger boomers and the Xers, which is somewhere in the region of £5.5 trillion, which is massive. And that's started. But I see nothing about that in the UK. I'm presenting next February at the FIA conference in Australia. They've got 2 or 3 sessions on what charities can do to take advantage of this big wealth transfer. I'm speaking in Poland on it in November, but it seems to be ignored by the UK. What can we do to try to get an evidence-led culture in not just the conference, but also in the information you get out? How could you make that happen?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question, Mark. And to me, being evidence-based is really important. I speak to that a lot in my roles in various organisations. And sometimes people say to me, well, how do you apply being evidence-based to trusts and foundations fundraising? But I believe you can apply it to any type of fundraising, looking back at what's worked, what hasn't worked, where did you succeed when you got funding. And it's one of the things I really bang on about when I teach my fundraising apprenticeship to my students, is look at the data and understand what it's telling you. And equally, when you say look at the data, and you're saying look at the market, actually looking at the market's really important, but also looking at the future. Where are your legacy supporters coming from today, and actually where are your future legacy supporters going to come from? So when you're actually doing your acquisition of new supporters, go out and see if you can find more of the same. So you're not looking for people who are younger or more trendy. You're looking for people who are very similar to those that are currently on your file for the short term, but obviously in the long term you need to think about how do you diversify your donor base. So I think there is an education piece there in terms of the Institute and what it's doing to help people understand what the evidence is telling us. So having that research from people like you, Mark, is invaluable, and we should be sharing it at convention. So I would like us to be definitely putting more on the convention portfolio about evidence-based, what's going on in the world, and thinking much more about what's coming down the road for us in terms of looking to future-proof the sector. So I think it's important that we do both. We look at what's going on now, but we also look at what's going on in other markets, what's going on globally. Obviously we think about technology, but we also think about the donors of today and what they're going to look like in the future, because they might not be the same. I think there's already evidence to say that millennials and Gen Zs are much more about seeing the evidence of their impact than certainly my generation was. We were perhaps a bit more trusting, and we would give our £10 to charity and assume that they're spending it in the best way. I've always said that actually it's important for us to show impact to our donors, and I don't think many charities do it well, if I'm honest. There's not much in the way of impact reports that I see, and lots of charities really struggle to demonstrate and show their worth. So I think there's a much bigger piece of work that the Institute could be doing in terms of sharing that experience and understanding, not just at convention, but perhaps even putting on special sessions where we do, like the sort of sessions you're talking about doing in Poland and Australia. Mark,
we're at the moment, I'm presenting tomorrow in Australia. I'm not in Australia. It's going to be through the wonders of the internet. But we've done, I think, and I've chatted with people like Claire Routley about this. I don't think anyone has ever done a study looking at why older donors with an average age of 76, so into their 80s and into their 90s, how do they make their final decisions about leaving gifts to legacies? And one of the things that we've found is there are three issues that charities, basically three problems that charities cause for themselves. Number one of the reasons why people take a charity out of the will is they've, as you've just said, poor impact reporting and rubbish thanking. Just getting the same thanks over and over again, and no real insight that a person is actually involved there. Rubbish communications they don't want, and the ubiquitous term for it is raffle tickets. It's almost like the slang term, you know, what's turning you off, what's making you think. Raffle tickets tends to come out. Now, obviously, raffle tickets are great for some people. I'm not criticising raffles, but it's used as shorthand for it's people asking me for things that they should know that I'm not interested in by now. And the third point is charities that ignore the humanity of the donor, the important points. So as you get older, you'll develop rituals. You'll always give at Christmas or something like that. But what older donors often tell us is, I give on my late husband's birthday. If that's something you're interested in, I'll be very happy to share, our findings and our data with you. And if we can do something together, so much the better.
Yeah, and I think that, for me, the findings that you've just mentioned there, it's not just about telling the directors of fundraising that. This is about telling the CEOs of charities and chairs of boards so that they're aware of what legacy donors are looking for. Legacies is an interesting one for me, because what I see a lot of charities doing is, as soon as somebody's put their hand up and said, I'm putting you in my will, they basically cut off all other forms of communication other than the legacy journey. Now, the legacy journey is important, but actually, if I'm a raffle player and I've always played the raffle, I still want to receive the raffle tickets, because that's how I started my journey. So the organisation needs to weave that in. And interestingly, Giles and I were talking earlier about the fact that despite the fact that we've got all the latest technology at our fingertips, supporter experience seems to have become more generic rather than actually tailored. And actually, it's really interesting that somebody says, I give on the anniversary of my husband's death. But how do you implement a journey around that?
Yeah.
The mechanics of that, around one person's feedback. When you're operating a machine operation of sort of 100,000 supporters, how do you sort of hone in on that? I think that is the challenge for charities. I don't know whether there's many out there that have cracked it, but obviously there are people and big charities whose job title is supporter experience. And I wonder if there's much we could learn from those charities, whether they're doing it well or not, I don't know. But I just don't understand how we could practically apply that. I think it's very challenging to do that. And I think the smaller charities are much better at it, because they've got smaller databases and often they're dealing sort of one-on-one with people. But the bigger charities have got to get better at it, because if it means that people are taking you out of their will, then that's not what the outcome we want.
And that's what we found. There's two papers that have been published in Australia. One was pre-COVID, basically, looking at the percentage of pledgers who've got a charity in their will. And Russell James was one of the authors of that. And obviously everyone will know of Russell James working with Rowan Wishart. And they found that somewhere in the region, I can't remember exactly, I think it was about 65% of pledge gifts actually ended up with a gift going to that charity. Another study has been done, again in Australia, and results just been published looking post-COVID, and the results they found that only 35% of pledge gifts are actually converting into gifts.
Yes.
So that's a big difference, and obviously their methodology is going to be slightly different, which I think that they highlight, but it's a massive change. But when we speak to donors, one of the things that they're saying to us at the moment, cost of living crisis is hitting my children, hitting my family, and I am reassessing my bequests based on that. They're not taking all the charities out, but what they're taking out the ones that seem to be, that value them the least, and that don't necessarily do the work that they feel is most important. So I think we've got lots of elements like this that we need to find. But again, it's going back to that point. How can we get the CIOF to disseminate that information? Because I do it, Giles do it. This is why we're doing this. But whenever we give a nudge to the CIOF saying, would you be interested in that? Which I've not done for a couple of years. I don't know if you have, Giles. We don't seem to get anywhere at all with them.
So this for me is the thought leadership work that I'm talking about, that I would really like us to sort of own that space as the sector body. we should be telling everybody about what's coming down the line. And I think that the feedback that you're sharing there, the evidence.
Yeah.
So Roger about loyalty also shared that stat, I think, about the fact that only a third or something of legacies actually convert to actually, when the person dies, still being in their will. That's quite a stark statistic, isn't it? When you think you're servicing, 3,000 pledges and actually only a third of them are then going to leave you a gift in their will. What can we do to increase that number? Because clearly we're not doing it right. Unless, of course, it's only ever going to be a third and we're never going to achieve better than that. That might well be the case, but I don't think we know enough about legacies in that respect. So I think there's much more work we could be doing in that specific example. But I think the work you're talking about is, we've got lots of experts in the sector, doing lots of great work. Unfortunately, I think in some cases people are doing it just because they want to advertise their own business, right? Which people have to do. So they don't always want to share.
Not us, Harps, no. I certainly want to advertise Blue Frog Fundraising Limited, the best fundraising agency in the world. Perish the thought.
Yeah, so they don't always want to share that information.
Yeah.
And they'll share it with their clients because they're paying them. So I think there needs to be a space for both things. For obviously, agencies do need money because they're trying to run a business. But secondly, the really important nuggets, how do we share that wider to a smaller charity that doesn't have the means to have a retained fundraising agency, for example? So I think there's probably some work we could collaborate on together to look at that.
What's happened about Dan's role? Because Dan always used to be great, but he left a couple of years ago.
But there has been another person put into that role.
I'm not sure who they were, but maybe I should hunt them out and try and get in touch, because Dan was always very good.
Yeah.
And he would always share stuff and listen, but maybe I need to build a new relationship with them.
I'd like to pick up on three things that you
Okay, Giles.
And you may have things to say or not. Well, everyone talks about evidence-based, and it's like a mantra, a bit like relationship fundraising and sport experience. And I remember I was pontificating on LinkedIn quite recently about my opinion on a particular thing. And one of my heroes, John Lepp, of Agents of Good, in America, he wrote a simple thing saying test, and it suddenly occurred to me, why was I pontificating about something? Test it. If it moves, test it, because that's how you get your evidence. We talk about evidence based, but you're only going to get evidence if you test.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
Okay.
I couldn't say more about that, Giles.
What?
I said I couldn't agree more about
fine.
that, really.
Then the second thing is, you mentioned technology. And one of the things that makes me really angry, having been in the sector an awful long time, is, I remember the first thank you letter I got 60 years ago. And I would have expected that in the following 60 years, technology would have meant that we could improve the experience of the donor. And actually, what we've done in fundraising with technology is to reduce the cost, not to improve the experience. And I just wondered, am I right? And am I right to be angry?
I think to a degree you are right, Giles. But I always think I remember when we sat on we created the Commission on the Donor Experience, and then I subsequently sat on the Supporter Experience Special Interest Group. I think what we certainly saw was that actually smaller charities were absolutely getting supporter experience bang on. It was actually the larger charities that were not getting it right. So I think and that's probably because smaller charities have less supporters, so they're really focused on making sure that those supporters are getting a positive experience. And I think probably one of the charities that sticks out in my mind, certainly, that I've worked for is MenCap, who have people with learning disabilities working in their supporter care team, and they provide the best thank yous. So when you put your hand up and say, I'm leaving a gift in my will to MenCap, you get a beautiful framed piece of artwork produced by one of those individuals. And I think, it speaks to the heart of what the cause is about, because the cause is providing employability for people with learning disabilities that might not be able to get work elsewhere. And actually those donors really appreciate those artworks that have come directly from an individual who's living with that condition. So I think, charities can do it well, but I think somewhere along the line it's got a little bit lost. And I think one thing I would recommend, and I always call out Lisa Sargent in all of my apprenticeship teachings is
We love Lisa.
yeah, because on Sophie she's got some really
Yeah.
good examples of thank you letters which are free for all of us to access, and it's brilliant because she does a before and then she does an after, and it's a world away. You know, the first one is what most charity letters look like, but actually when she rewrites it, it really kind of speaks to the heart of the cause, and it's just written in such a completely different way. And I think there is a challenge in the sector in terms of getting good fundraising copy, because people think, you know, I've heard people use the word, oh, this is so gushy about fundraising appeals. But actually, you know, exactly like you say, Giles, when you've tested appeals, you know, and we've all probably done ones where we've been told, oh, you know, fundraising is from the heart, not the head. So you try a sort of more sort of fact and figure based letter versus a more emotional one. But based on what works, you'll use that. And in some charities, it might well be the head that's more important, but for some, it's the heart. And I would say probably for most, it's the heart. You know, if I'm leaving a gift in my will, it's because that organisation matters to me. So I think largely they come from here. And if we think about the causes that people give to, it's because they've got that personal connection, or somebody that they know has had that condition, or they're living with that condition, or some, you know, they want to be able to give. And so some people, you know, feel empowered to give because they want to give to a charity that's working overseas. They can't physically go overseas, but they trust a charity to do it for them. So there's many reasons, I think, why, you know, fundraising is important.
And I think the other thing that we have to remember in thanking, one of the things we do at Blue Frog, we call it dynamic thanking. We change it regularly. You know, both Giles and I do quite a lot of mystery shopping on thanking. And I remember I did one last year. And, you know, I tend to give quite sizable gifts. And my thanks to a gift that I gave last year was talking about the impact of COVID on their work now. You know, that was a thank you that somebody had changed in 2020, perhaps, and it was still the same thank you going out. I've got other organisations that we did a test with where we received quite a nice thank you email. And then 2 or 3 days later, I got that exact same copy as a letter. You know, the exact same copy as a letter. And then obviously you give subsequent gifts and you get exactly the same email time after time after time. And I think these simple things, well, you don't need training. You don't really need a huge amount of support. As you said, if you write something personal, that's a great way to enhance your fundraising. There's an old, I can't remember the name of the agency, McConkey Johnson, I think it was. And they did a study many, many years ago. They did a test and they found that if a donor received a personal thank you through the post within 48 hours of the gift being received, they were something like 4 times more likely to give again. And, you know, if you ask me as a fundraiser, what is the one single thing that I can do to, you know, reduce attrition, increase average gift, increase that likelihood of receiving a legacy, it literally is sort out your thanking program.
Yeah,
the
I
number
totally
one.
agree.
But most organisations, always an afterthought. So I shall look forward to the CIOF racking up the thanking.
It's really
votes.
important key part of sports experience, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, if we give to charities, so some people say, oh well, those donors don't want to thank you, but in my mind, donors don't always mean what they say. So if you run a focus group,
100%.
they'll say it because they think it's the right thing to say.
I don't need to be thanked all the time.
Yeah.
And then 2 seconds or 2 minutes later, 3 minutes later, it was lovely to hear that my money had made a difference, that it was appreciated. Always. They contradict themselves 2 minutes later.
And I think one of the other things I would say about that, Mark, is that too often with what I'm finding is you've got a group of people who are digital donors and you've got a group of people who are offline. And so the offline ones are only getting that offline, and they might get copies of the appeal digitally if they've got an email address. But rarely do we take the digital donors and think, let's try giving them something offline and see if that works. So just because they're giving digitally doesn't mean they can't get a paper thank you through the post. I think enough of that is not done.
And it always works.
Yeah.
It always works. And the key thing that you find more and more, particularly amongst mid-value, they'll get the paper appeal in the post, they go online to give. And some organisations at that point cancel the DM. And suddenly and then they say, oh, why aren't these working? take it offline, particularly if people are giving sizable gifts. And what's a sizable gift? The lowest you can probably take it is about £50. So £50, 100 Australian dollars, 70, 80 US dollars. Those people are indicating, I'm giving you more than the average. I've either got the wealth or the interest. Take it offline.
I mean, I can give you an example of one charity I've worked with. They've got 40,000 cash supporters offline, cash supporters, 600,000 digital donors. Those 40,000 cash supporters are giving the same amount of money as those 600,000 digital supporters. Yeah. So whilst we're all chasing nirvana and saying digital is the way, I don't think it's the only way, and we have to do both things, and we have to try and get both things working. So that cross-pollination is really important, and that testing, Giles, is really important, so you can get the learning.
Because I think that's one of the problems. When you speak to mid-value donors, again, what they'll say is, often the wealthier ones, they'll say, I saw something, read something in The Economist, or I saw something on the news, on Newsnight, or wherever in the world it is, and I went online to give. But after that, what they also say is, I'd like to see reports. I'd like to feel a valued member of a value group, and I think that's 100% right. That it's very easy to send an email. You have to put a little bit of heart and soul into sending, that letter, and that's what donors value. And of course, the other thing about that valuable group, they don't really use Facebook that much. They don't necessarily use Insta that much. So how are you going to communicate? How are you going to recruit them in the first place? If you're not one of these big global UNHCRs or World Food Programme or MSFs that don't get on the news, how are you going to bring those people on board? And they still read newspapers. They still read magazines. I think, I wouldn't necessarily recommend to advertising it, but I couldn't believe it. I was looking at the stats the other day. The Daily Express still sells 100,000 copies. It's amazing that 100,000 people still read the Daily Express, which, I don't know if you've looked at it recently, but it's not the greatest newspaper.
Not as bad as the Daily Mail.
At
least about the Daily Mail, the better, I think, at the moment. So, coming back, building on that, you talked about the Institute being like the representative body and being out there fighting for fundraisers. Do you feel that on a reactive basis, or do you feel that the Institute should be proactive in actually thinking about the Daily Mail and what they might be picking up on and trying to create a defensive strategy? Do you think that you should be creating, if this would happen, this would be our contingency plan for it happening? Is that going too far, or?
I don't know about the word defensive, because I just think when you start being defensive, then I don't think, it tends to get people's backs up. And we know we've all been there when the media has been quite negative towards fundraising, and it still is. If you think about the face-to-face fundraisers, they're still called chuggers to this day. I'm not sure there's much we can do to influence that, because despite the fact that news outlets have been told not to use those words, they still continue to use them. All we can do is to continue to value those fundraisers and make sure that they feel like they're in a sector where fundraisers don't say, I don't like that type of fundraising, because I do hear that as well from fundraisers saying that that type of giving or that type of fundraising is negative and I don't want to be associated with that. I think actually as a sector we need to stick together. And we need to speak as one, whether we like or don't like particular types of fundraising. It's really important, because actually all types of fundraising are feeding that fundraising funnel, not just one type. So I think it's important to support each other and have each other's backs.
So I was talking about having a defensive strategy, and you picked me up on not liking the word defensive. So just an example, if you take face-to-face fundraising, for example, or private site fundraising, 95% of it can be done well. 5% of it can be done badly. The media, the Daily Mail, pick up on the 5% that's being done badly. Are you saying that we should, rather than being defensive, we should actually say, look at these 95%, look at what they're achieving, for the cause?
Yeah, and actually, if you want to see it in practice, go and spend a day with a fundraising agency and actually stand on the street or go door to door with them and see what sort of experience people are having. But at the end of the day, we all know journalists are all about the headlines and trying to sell their newspapers. and the shock factor, which they tend to find within fundraising. And I'm not saying we always get it right. Obviously, we make mistakes. But actually, I think on the whole, actually as a sector, for the amount of fundraising that's going on, I think there's something like over 160,000 charities in this country. So every single day, most of us are doing it right. You know, occasionally mistakes happen.
Oh, yeah, and it's a very small number. If we look at the fundraising preference service, you know, the number of complaints and things that people get, and the number of people who say, I want to be removed from all lists, it's tiny. It's 0 point something, you know, percentage. It's very small numbers. But that point that you raised, you know, talking about a defensive strategy, and we recommended this a number of years ago, after the Haiti scandal. We did a big piece of research looking at attitudes to giving around that. And we went around not everyone wanted to hear, but we went around a lot of the big development agencies, overseas aid agencies, and saying, this is the impact that it's had. These are the solutions. And one of the solutions we recommended was a proactive advertising campaign in publications like the Daily Mail, where every month you know, a collective did an advert. This is what is being achieved, because people don't know about the fall in the death rates of under fives. They don't know about the improvements in literacy amongst young girls. They don't know about the vaccination rates that we're now achieving. They simply don't know. They think that money's being wasted. And we don't speak to those people. We choose to ignore them. You know, it doesn't cost much for a full-page ad in the Daily Mail once a month. We could go out and actually say, this is what we are achieving. This is what we are doing. You know, the National Lottery do that, you know, in terms of their ads. We see Comic Relief do that. We see Children in Need do that. We are the sector that does that work. It is our specialism. We should be proud about informing the, let's say, you know, the slightly misinformed Daily Mail reader of what the sector delivers and what it has done historically. You know, massive social changes about, you know, that have come out through people giving small amounts of money to charity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, and I think if we go back to your earlier point, Mark, where you're saying actually only a small number of people actually say they don't want to hear from charities anymore. But what we do know in terms of the landscape is that less people are giving. It's the same people that are continuing to give. And if we were more proactive and educating the public more about what charities are achieving, perhaps we might shift that dial, and actually more people might suddenly decide to give to charity that are currently not. Because there was a point, wasn't there, where charities were seen as less trustworthy than
journalists,
than other sectors, and it's quite shocking actually. Yeah. So I think the Olive Cook incident definitely damaged our reputation as a sector, and we've had to do a lot of work, I think, to get ourselves forward from that. And I wouldn't say we're completely out of the woods with the impact of what was felt from that incident in time. But I think, you know, we could definitely be much more proactive about engaging the public with our achievements as a sector.
Yeah.
You know.
I think COVID improved it.
I think you're right.
Yeah, at COVID there was a massive sea change, and there's not been any real negative stories since then, you know, major ones that have come through. And I think we need to build on that. But the other point, you know, to raise that is giving is a niche activity. A tiny percentage, what is it? I can't remember what the stats were. It's about 4 or 5% of people give the best part of 45% of all money to charity. And even when we look at the wealthier group, the average salary is about 36,000, and the average monthly gift is about £20. If we looked at the top 1%, so somebody earning £250,000 a year, their average gift, £40. What can we do? We need to up our asks. We need to stop going for the lowest common denominator. One of the problems I think we had was £3 a month. Suddenly charity was as cheap as chips, and it's not. If you want cures to diseases, if you want children to grow up in a better life, if you want to end injustice, invest some money in it. And we need to be proud about saying that, because these things can make a huge difference to the world. But we got to the position over that, you know, that 10-year period of £2 a month, or even just £2, where we lost our way.
While Mark's been talking, I've just been reflecting on two things that you said. One is about the role of the Institute as kind of representing fundraising to the public. And then you also talked about engaging with the public. And you also you criticised me for talking about being defensive. Do you think there's a role for the Institute in being proactive in building relationships with newspapers and other media to actually sell fundraising, to sell the advantages of charities?
Yeah.
Do you think the Institute does that? Does it do it enough?
I actually don't know. I don't actually know whether they do
don't
enough.
much
It could
either.
be something that they do behind closed doors that we don't know about.
But we should.
But we should
Do
know
you
about
agree
it.
that? Well, okay,
if
but
we're
do you think
doing it.
we should
Yeah.
be doing it. We should be doing more of it.
Yes.
We should be talking to the Daily Mail, finding a contact in the Daily Mail that we can build a relationship with to try and get good stories.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, I think I can't remember one of the charities I've worked with, quite a lot of the donors on their database are Daily Mail readers. So although in the sector we think the Daily Mail is actually a really awful publication and actually it doesn't serve us well because it's always got negative stories about fundraising, on the other hand, actually quite a lot of their readers are people who give to charity. So there's a bit of
and volunteers.
Yes, so there's a bit of a dichotomy there, isn't there? So how do we keep the editors and the people who are writing the stories of that newspaper engaged with fundraising in a positive way? But as a sector body, I think we owe it that we actually working with all types of organisations, whether they're journalists, whether it's the NCVO, so we're making sure volunteers who are volunteering to fundraise for us are given the best experience. We should be working, and I think we are working with quite a lot of different organisations in partnership, and that's the sort of work I'm saying that we need to be shouting about a little bit more, so people understand the value of their membership of the Institute.
And if you do want to speak to the editor of the Daily Mail, put an ad in the Daily Mail every month. They're going to see that every single month when they go through, and that strikes me as a very, very inexpensive way to change the attitude about what the sector can deliver.
And building on that, if you think about the Daily Mail, it's not good news that sells paper; it's bad news that sells papers.
Yeah.
So and fundraising is all about good news. It's about doing good things. So that's not really of interest to the editor of the Daily Mail. That's not what the selling papers. It's the Olive Cook story that sells papers. So how do we create? I haven't got the answer to this. How do we create the stories that are going to be attractive to Daily Mail readers and therefore be attractive to Daily Mail editors? And your idea, putting an ad in the Daily Mail every week
Every month.
with some sort of story that's going to be interesting to the reader, but actually also promoting fundraising.
How money's made a difference. The other side to there's a great book called on this point called "Bring Me a Murder a Day." In terms of that's going to sell papers, but the other side of that, and you have to remember, the only page that really matters on the Daily Mail is the front cover. If you've got a splurge on that about how terrible you are, then that resonates.
Yeah.
But inside, so much of it is magazine-led, human interest. It's human interest stories, and we see that everywhere. How an individual life was changed.
Yes.
Bringing bringing a donor, face to face to whatever cause they care about.
Yeah.
That can be done, but it's proactive. It needs to have someone who's going to focus on that rather than doing the reactive stuff.
I think you're right, Mark.
Or the fun stuff about coming up with some new product aimed at some sort of subscription model type pack, which I think we have all now realised was a complete waste of money.
In our last few minutes, Harps, is there anything we haven't talked about that you wanted to say? I mean, I noticed you were preparing some notes beforehand. Have we covered the things that you want to talk about? You're the next chair of the Institute. What would you like to say to our audience that you haven't already said?
I think one of the things I would say is I'm very keen to hear from people if they've got thoughts about what they would like to see from the Institute, You know, I'm only one person, and obviously I'm going to have that away day with the board, and we'll think about what we see as the future of the Institute. But it's really important to me that members and non-members provide feedback about what they think the Institute should be about.
Do you do a survey? Is there an annual survey?
I don't know whether they do a survey.
I can't remember last time I was asked. Yeah.
I can't remember either. I don't think I've seen a survey, but maybe that's something we could look at doing. But I'd be really keen to understand from people what they see the Institute as doing for them, or wanting to see the Institute do more of, or perhaps less of, so we can kind of feed that in to the learning. So if anybody wants to get in touch with me, I'm more than happy to hear from them.
We will put an email on the screen.
Yes,
there.
please.
So do that. We'll put an email on the screen.
Yeah, it's there now, Giles. Look, there's the email right in front of you. It arrived.
Over and above
Still
that,
there.
without wishing to commit you, I think we should actually commit to having Harps back in a year.
Harps, you
and
can
after
come
you-
back
will you come back
whenever
in a
you
year?
like.
Yeah,
And,
and see where we are.
Spending an
Well,
hour
yeah,
with you is a
just
joy any day.
See how the Institute has developed it
Yeah.
in that year,
Okay.
when you've been a year in post, and that would be great if you could come back in a year.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank
But
you.
Mark, is there more that you want to say before you hand over?
I've had a great time. It's been slightly therapeutic for me. So thank you for coming in and listening to me
thanks,
whine
Harps.
a little bit.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We all done? Thanks for watching and happy fundraising.